So we're going to start chapter 7 today. I just posted the link in the chat, or
Got it.
for those who are watching this on YouTube at some later point, it's jewisharcadia.com/7886. And we're starting chapter 7, which talks about the fundamental difference between permissible items or relationships in this world versus forbidden things. Um, the chapter will be divided into four parts. Um, One is the first part of the chapter will be dedicated to defining the klipa, the shell, the negative side, so to speak, of things that's considered the shining side. That's the first part of the chapter. The second part of the chapter will talk about elevating permissible items to holiness, or alternatively, taking permissible things and drowning them and sinking them into unholiness. And then the third part of the chapter will talk about the incarceration of prohibited things in the realm of holiness. So things that are prohibited are locked in, they're behind the gate, they can't be released from unholiness. And then the fourth part of the chapter will talk about the distinction between the sin of a seminal emission versus that of prohibited relationships with other people. Um, and then there's also a footnote that elaborates on that topic as well, which we'll get to over there. So, to give a little background, at the end of the previous chapter, chapter 6, we talked about how there's the three completely impure klipos, the three completely impure elements that have no good to it, which is the lowest type of impurity. And the Alter Rebbe over there explained the types of growing things, living things, speaking beings, in other words, human, who receive their nurture and vitality from this negative side of things. In this chapter, the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about the other type of klipa, the other type of shell or impurity, which is called the shining klipa. Um, so first, he's going to specify the parts of creation from either inanimate objects or things that grow or living beings, animals, or people who get their life force from this level of impurity. And then we'll talk about the impurity itself. And the general rule is that um, anything that, on the one hand, is permissible, meaning there's nothing prohibited about it, but on the other hand, it doesn't have anything holy in it, then you know it's from this shining klipa. So anything that's not bad, but also isn't holy per se, that is this middle ground, this shining klipa, this shining impurity that we're going to be discussing. So, chapter 7, you may follow along in the text online, or you can just listen. I'm not going to use the exact translation online. I'm going to use my own poetic license for that. So he starts with ach, however, meaning in contrast to the completely impure things we discussed in chapter 6. Now we're going to talk about the shining klipa. Nefesh achiyunis habamis shebiyisrael shemitzad klipa. The vivifying soul, the animal soul that's in a Jew that comes from impurity. We talked about in chapter 1 of Tanya how every Jew has a godly soul, but also an animal soul. And that animal soul has certain animalistic tendencies, but it comes from this shining klipa. It's neither here nor there. It's, yes, it's not holy per se, but it's also not bad. It's somewhere in between. And he says, "Hamalubeshes bedam ha'adam kinizkalel." This is what encloses itself in the person's blood. In other words, it's what keeps you alive, right? You can have a corpse, which is identical to a living being, but it's a corpse because it's not alive. What keeps the person alive? The animal soul. Um, and that's that comes from the side of impurity, but it's the shining impurity. And because it keeps a person alive, it's not just called the animal soul, but it's called the vivifying soul because it gives, as we say in French, vivre. It gives us life. Um, Now, why is it called an animal soul? Because the life of this type of soul is a physical life. All of our physical, natural tendencies come from that soul. And all that soul, this animal soul wants is that you should live a life of enjoyment and pleasure just like an animal. You just want to sit all day and eat grass. Well, maybe we have other pleasures too, but the idea is whatever the body wants to do, those drives, those ambitions. I want to be alive. I want to be healthy. I want to be rich. I want to be powerful. All of those wants and desires come from the animal soul. So now we know the source of certain experiences that we have is from this animal soul, which comes from more broadly in the spiritual realms, it comes from this shining klipa. What else comes from that shining klipa? The souls of animals, wild animals, birds, v'dagim, tahirim umutarim b'achila, and fish that are pure and permissible to eat. All of that also comes from this realm of the shining klipa. And v'kiyum v'chayas kol adaimim v'chol atzemeach hamutar b'achila. The life, the vitality of anything that's like minerals or things that grow that you're allowed to eat, that all comes from this shining klipa. You're allowed to eat grass. I don't recommend it, but you're allowed to eat parsley and spinach, which is essentially a form of grass. It's just fancy grass. It's human grass, you know. As long as there aren't, unkosher animals or insects embedded within them, then they're kosher. This is interesting because now we're not talking about a physical object, but we're talking about the life and vitality that a person puts into every action, speech, or thought in matters of this world. So, for example, the act of eating or the thought of business, right? She'ein bohem tzad isur. There is absolutely nothing wrong about them. There's not even a side of wrong. Some things are, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. There's nothing wrong with eating. There's nothing wrong with doing business. Le sheirish v'le anaf, not a root of, not even a branch of mishasam. It's a slice of sev anfein deraisa derabanan. It doesn't have any association with any of the 365 prohibitions of the Torah or any rabbinical prohibitions. You're doing nothing wrong by eating or earning a living. So then what's the problem? Why are we saying that this comes from even a shining level of impurity? Here's the thing. Rak she'enon l'shem shamayim. But we're talking about cases where the person is doing these acts not for the sake of heaven. Ella ritzain haguf v'cheftzei v'tavasei. The motivation is because my body wants it, and I desire it, and I lust it. So ideally, our sages tell us in the book of Ethics, Ethics of Our Fathers, that everything you do should be for the sake of heaven. That means even when you eat, drink, sleep, do work, they should all be with the purpose of serving God in some way. That you should be healthy in order that you should be able to serve God better. So, yes, you have to do all these things. They're necessary to stay alive. And yes, there's a Torah mandate to stay alive. But if it's just to enjoy life, and that's your only motivation, then that's not a praiseworthy way of living. This is what our ethical teachers tell us. But rather, all of the drive and purpose behind these things that we're doing should be in order to serve God. So when you're thinking thoughts of, I don't know, how many screwdrivers do I have to buy? Whatever. How many 2x4s do I need to pick up from Home Depot in order to build my shed, or whatever it might be? Things that are totally permissible. There's nothing wrong with them. You don't need to have a guilty conscience that you went to Home Depot yesterday. It's okay. You're a good Jew, right? But if you're not doing it to serve God, but it's just because I want to enjoy life, then they come from the side of impurity. Yes, there's nothing wrong with it. I want to clarify again and again. Nothing wrong with any of it, but it still gets its vitality, that drive, that energy that you put into whatever task that might be, that's completely kosher, can still come from the side of this shining impurity. And the Alter Rebbe says even further, even if this is something that's necessary to keep the body alive, you literally cannot live without it. I had bread and butter this morning because otherwise I wouldn't be alive. I got to eat, right? But we're talking about a case where his intention isn't for the sake of heaven, in order to serve Hashem better with his body. So then that's still under the category of klipa. It's this shell, it's this impure other side, meaning this world lives in a binary. We either have things that are holy or things that are on a pendulum, but the pendulum never lands in the middle. Either it lands in the side of holy, or if we're just doing it to enjoy life, then it lands in the unholy side. So if you don't feel in your eating and your working and that it's somehow connected to godliness, then the pendulum ends up in the side of unholiness. And he says, these thought, speech, words, or deeds are not any better than the animal soul itself. So just like the animal soul, the desire to live, the desire to remain alive and exist comes from the animal soul as opposed to the godly soul. These acts that you do, eating, working, whatever it is, if they're not specifically for the sake of heaven, they end up in the camp of the animal soul, which comes from the side of klipa. Why is that? And that's because all of these powers, the thoughts, the speech, the deeds that we're doing, they get their vitality from this second tier of impurity, meaning not the very deep, sunken in, three impure, bad, no good, no bueno side of unholiness, but it's this tier up, which is called Shehi Klipa Revius. It's the fourth Klipa, and it creates Klipas Nega, which is called the shining Klipa. Why is it called shining? This is in the last class we looked up the book of Ezekiel. In chapter 1 of Ezekiel talks about a whole prophecy that Ezekiel saw. He saw the chariots in heaven. Anyways, we're not going to go into the whole thing, but in verse 4 over there, it talks about different descriptions of powerful forces, which Kabbalah explains is referring to these impure powers. And it says over there the words "v'noiga lo saviv," and it's radiant around it. This radiance is a reference to this sort of in-between impurity. So the word noiga means shining. In other words, as opposed to the three completely impure forces, which have no good, they have no light in them at all, because it's like a hard shell that doesn't allow, if you have sunlight and you have a cover over something and it's a very thick cover, the sunlight won't break through that cover, right? Similarly, the forces of impurity cover over the light of God that's inside everything. So, for example, a piece of pork, which is no bueno, it's totally unkosher, right? Of course, it wouldn't exist without godliness, but it's called klipa, it's called impurity because there's a thick shell, there's a thick spiritual covering over it that doesn't allow the shine, the radiance of godliness to get into that. And so there's zero light of godliness apparent in that. Whereas the klipas noiga, the shining klipa, means that it's not a complete blockade of any godliness getting into that, but there is a little bit of spiritual radiance in that, intermediate stuff. So the klipas noga, the shining klipa, means that it has a mixture of good and evil, which the idea that things could be mixed with good and evil, which essentially our whole world is that way, originated by Adam and Eve when they ate from the tree of knowledge. That suddenly there was this idea that, not everything is completely pure, but even good things have, they can have a negative motivation, or even things that aren't necessarily holy, but they could be made holy, and everything's just mixed up with each other. And if you're feeling mixed up about what I'm saying now, that's because that's the world we live in. We live in a world that there's good and evil mixed into it. So let's bring it back to the animal soul. So the animal soul, our personal drive to stay alive. There you go. You got a rhyme. The drive to stay alive is it has potential to become holy. You could take that drive to stay alive and use it in a holy way. He says that sorry, I'm going back inside the text of the Tanya. I know I went off on a little tangent, but what was he saying? He was saying that there's a fourth klipa, this shining klipa, Shaba Eilam Hazeh, which exists in this world. Hanikra Eilam HaAsiya, which is the world of Asiya. There's four spiritual worlds. This is the bottom of the four. Not going to go into all of that right now. Rubai Kekuleira, which the majority of this world is evil. In other words, there's spiritual worlds where it's, purely good. And then there's another world in the spiritual realm that has a flavor of not good. And then there's half and half. And then there's mostly not good and some good. But this physical world that we live in is a world where there's so much evil that it almost feels like it's all evil. But he says, there's a little bit of good mixed into it. Meaning there's a potential, even though it might look terrible on the outside, but there's the potential to have a revelation of godliness in this world, a revelation of good. And that potential, he says in the parentheses, that's where we have the source of the good innate qualities that every Jew has, even in their animal soul. As we explained in chapter 1, which it's brought from the Gemara, I believe, that that there are three signs of a Jewish person: that they're bashful, that they're compassionate, and that they're kind-hearted, they're generous. That's part of the innate qualities of a Jew, not just from their godly soul, but even their animal soul has this natural desire to be bashful, compassionate, and generous. Now, all of that, and the drive to live, the natural tendencies that we have, even if they're not necessarily spiritually motivated, and all that, all comes from this shining klipa. V'hi bechina memutzas, and this is a intermediate level bein shalish klipas atmeis legamri, between the three completely impure impurities, uvein bechinas umadregas hakadusha, and the level of holiness. So klipas noga is basically a mix. The shining klipa is a mixture of good and evil, and it has an association with the complete evil side because it does have some evil, and it also has an association with the good side because of the good that's inside of it. And so that's why it's called an intermediary klipa. And therefore, there are times when this intermediary klipa gets included in the completely impure impurities, as quoted from the Zohar. So because it has potential for evil it can actually descend fully into evil. That's possible. But sometimes this shining klipa can be included in and be elevated to the level of holiness. Because since it has good inside of it, it has the potential to be elevated and included into the realms of holiness. That means when the good that's inside of this shining klipa is separated and extracted from the evil, and it overpowers the side of evil, and it's therefore elevated and included into holiness. So basically, in order for this shining klipa to go up to holiness, there's two stages. First of all, we have to clarify the distinction between the good and evil within it. Because only the good element of this shining klipa is able to be elevated. Now, once you separate the two, then you can say, okay, now this good side is going to overpower the evil, and now it could go up higher. Because if they're on the same level and you pull this one up, it's going to go up together. But if you separate them and you kind of put the good side above and overpowering the bad side, then that can now be drawn upward to holiness, leaving the bad side behind. So to give a physical example, because this is all in the conceptual. So you have a physical food, a piece of steak, kosher steak. Ruth, we'll call it Ruth Malka's Steakhouse. That has, they're selling a steak, kosher certified. That steak has a mixture of good and evil. What's the evil part of that steak? That's the portion that covers over and hides the godliness inside of this food. That's the good flavor of the food. The fact that, this is going to make my belly feel good. I'm going to feel like a rich man that I just had $160, ribeye steak, right? And this enjoyment, you have to understand practically what happens when somebody indulges in worldly pleasures. It causes less than holy types of behaviors. Somebody who's a glutton, right? It doesn't just express itself in gluttony, but they're going to be cruel. They're going to be, ungenerous. All of those other things lend itself and fit right in with the whole idea of gluttony. So if you're going to just eat as a glutton, that is the negative side that's contained in that steak. So we want to stay away from that. We don't want to stay away from steak. We just want to stay away from the gluttony in eating a steak. So what's the good side of a steak? In other words, how do you reveal the godliness in that steak? It's by recognizing and eating it with the purpose of strengthening the body and giving the body strength in order to be able to serve Hashem and worship Him properly. So how do you do that? So the way you elevate that piece of meat is, first of all, you have to separate the good from the evil. In other words, you have to take your mind off of the enjoyment of it and to only be captured by the good part of it, that this is going to give me protein, it's going to strengthen my body, and this is really something that as a Jew is important to me, because when I daven, when I go to shul, when I learn Tanya, I need to be relaxed and content and healthy and focused, and and in order to do that, I have to have good healthy food, right? So when I realize that there's two elements in this one piece of meat, and I can separate one from the other, now I could say, okay, I know what's good about this, I know what's unholy about this, and now I can focus on the good and elevate that good to holiness, that I am going to eat this piece of meat only in order to serve Hashem better. And that's how we take this, the vitality, the spiritual energy that's enclosed in this piece of meat, and you bring it up to the level of holiness. In other words, you are thereby revealing the godliness in that meat, which is to help you serve Hashem. So to summarize what we learned today, the last week we talked about the completely impure elements, but today we're discussing how there's an element of impurity, which is a shining impurity, and that's an intermediate level between holiness and complete impurity. And it has a little bit of holiness and a little bit of impurity. It has a mixture of both. And this shining klipa, which is what gives this world that we live in vitality, is a world that has mostly evil and it has some good. And that shining klipa is also the source of our animalistic soul, and it also is what keeps kosher animals alive. It keeps basic food that we eat in existence. That is a spiritual energy, because nothing could live without spiritual energy, without godly energy. But it's this shining klipa which is what keeps all those things in existence. And that's also what keeps all our actions, all our behaviors that are permissible and kosher and fine. Things that are fine are coming from this shining klipa. And it's our job to make it not just fine, but to make it good and to make it holy and to reveal the godly energy in that thing. And we'll give some more examples about comedy and good wine and other things that can be elevated. But we'll talk about that next week.